The story of Empress Sisi began like the most beautiful fairy tale. A young emperor falls in love with a stunning princess. But her life at the Austrian court turned into a nightmare she would spend the rest of her days trying to escape. At the heart of her suffering was her difficult relationship with Archduchess Sophie, her monster-in-law. But what exactly went wrong between the young bride and the powerful mother of the emperor? Let's figure it out in this video. Welcome back to Female Tales. I'm Yulia, and together on this channel, we explore the stories of remarkable women from history. If history speaks to you, like the video, join our community, and let's head straight into the depths of the past. The love story of Emperor Franz Joseph and Elisabeth of Bavaria, and her conflict with her husband's mother, is probably one of the most dramatized royal tales in film and television. And no wonder, there's everything. A young emperor who falls not for the calm, proper sister Helena, who was chosen for him, but for the spirited, beautiful Elisabeth. Then comes the tension, the power struggle, the cold and cruel mother-in-law, and the young empress suffering for love. But the reality was far more multifaceted. To understand why the relationship between these two women was complicated from the very beginning, we need to look at the historical context and at what kind of world Sisi was stepping into at the Austrian court. First of all, when 23-year-old Franz Joseph fell in love with his 15-year-old bride, who was also his cousin, he had only been emperor for 5 years. He ruled over an empire with 36 million subjects, and he owed his position in large part to his mother. When the Austrian Revolution broke out in 1848, contemporaries described Sophie as the only man at court. She showed impressive leadership skills, and together with key political figures, convinced the reigning emperor and her physically and mentally frail husband to abdicate in favour of her 18-year-old son. Naturally, she became the real power behind the throne who held enormous influence over the young emperor. After all, placing someone on the throne is one thing, keeping them there is something else entirely. And just imagine what kind of willpower and, well, steel nerves this woman must have had. She was even nicknamed the Secret Empress. Now, it's also important to note that Sophie loved her son deeply, though she probably loved her other son, Maximilian, even more. Still, unlike Queen Victoria, who blamed her son Bertie for everything, Sophie saw Franz as a miracle. He was a child born after a series of miscarriages and a very difficult pregnancy and birth. So for her, he wasn't just one of many children. He was the centre of her world. Second, the Austrian court was obsessed with ritual and ceremony, almost to the point of worship. You might remember how I once said that Versailles Protocol sometimes felt like madness. Well, the Habsburg court etiquette, imported from Spain, was even worse. It was rigid, cold, and basically the backbone of imperial authority. Now, imagine a 15-year-old girl, free-spirited, stubborn, and completely inexperienced, trying to find her place in that system. She was the complete opposite of her future mother-in-law. And honestly, she didn't have much in common with her future husband either. Sisi had grown up in the relaxed, informal world of Possenhofen Castle, running barefoot through the fields of Bavaria, and now she was expected to function like clockwork in the most rigid court in Europe. In fact, Sophie initially welcomed Elisabeth as a potential daughter-in-law with genuine warmth. She had known her since childhood. After all, Sisi was her niece, and the two families often saw each other, especially through Elisabeth's mother, Ludovica. When it became clear that Franz had fallen for Sisi, Sophie wrote to her other son in a letter filled with joy, calling Elisabeth dear, lovely Sisi, and describing her only in affectionate terms as the dear little one. Like Queen Victoria, Sophie kept detailed diaries and an extensive correspondence throughout her life, which allows us to get a glimpse into her real thoughts. And to her credit, she never once wrote anything openly negative about her daughter-in-law. What's more, during the official church outing for the engagement, Sophie deliberately stepped aside and let her young niece walk ahead. A gesture of respect and generosity within the strict hierarchy of court protocol, especially for someone as powerful as Sophie. She also gifted Elisabeth several very valuable pieces of jewellery for the wedding, the same ones she herself had worn on her own wedding day, and she even personally arranged Sisi's rooms. Lavishly, of course, and entirely to her own taste, decorating them so opulently they were practically dripping in gold. So, if everything started out so perfectly, when did things begin to fall apart? Most likely, it was around the time of Sisi's arrival in Vienna and the wedding itself, when Elisabeth suddenly realised she would never be truly free again, and Sophie realised that her new daughter-in-law had a lot to learn. Sisi had spent months preparing for the role of Empress. She took lessons in Italian, studied Austrian history, and, at Sophie's insistence, even carefully scrubbed her teeth every day. But none of that helped her emotionally when April 24th, 1854, her wedding day, finally came. Overwhelmed, Elisabeth appeared at the reception with tears in her eyes. When she spotted her cousins Adelgunde and Hildegard of Bavaria in the crowd, she ran toward them to hug them. But Sophie immediately reminded her of the protocol. No hugs. Everyone was supposed to kiss her hand. Sisi protested, but we're cousins. She spent most of the celebration in silence. No one was allowed to speak to her first, and she was too shy to start a conversation herself. It was so boring having to remember who was the most important and rationing one's words accordingly, she would later recall. Sounds like anything but a dream wedding to me. What do you think? And then, of course, there was the wedding night. After escorting the newlyweds to their room, Sophie didn't retire to her own quarters. She stayed to sleep in an adjoining chamber. The next morning, over breakfast, she subjected the young couple to a detailed interrogation about how the night had gone. By the end of the day, the entire court already knew that the marriage had not yet been consummated. It wasn't until the third night that the young emperor and empress finally completed their union, after which they were once again summoned to breakfast or another interrogation. Elisabeth, who was simply not used to this level of scrutiny, this constant attention and judgment from strangers, just wanted to be left alone. But she had no choice but to face her mother-in-law again. Much later, she would confide in her lady-in-waiting, Countess Marie Festetics. The emperor was so used to obeying her that he gave in to this demand as well. But it was horrible for me. I went only for his sake. Fairy tales usually end at the wedding, but in real life, that's when the real challenges begin. For Elisabeth, life as an empress started not with joy and freedom, but with something more like imprisonment, with her mother-in-law as the warden. Her entire household was shaped and controlled by Archduchess Sophie. Most of the ladies around Elisabeth were significantly older and placed there specifically to monitor her every step. At the head of this entourage was Countess Esterhazy, a 56-year-old guardian of court etiquette who constantly reminded the young and inexperienced empress of her place in the hierarchy and the proper priority to be given to every guest. Even the time Elisabeth spent with her own husband was under surveillance. If Sisi and Franz happened to walk together through the quieter parts of the palace, it wouldn't be long before Sophie found out and shut it down. From that point on, they had to be accompanied at all times by court officials. Years later, Elisabeth would open up to her trusted lady-in-waiting and share how painful those early months of marriage had been. I cried so much here, Marie. Just thinking about that time tightens my chest. This is where I lived after my wedding. I felt so abandoned, so alone. Of course, the emperor couldn't be here during the day. He went into Vienna every morning. Until then, I was alone the whole day, dreading the moment when Archduchess Sophie would come. She came every day to spy on me every hour. I was completely at the mercy of this cruel woman. Everything I did was wrong. She criticized everyone I loved. She found everything out because she was constantly spying. The whole house was so afraid of her that even the smallest thing became a matter of state. Sophie took Elisabeth's dissatisfaction as a personal insult. She couldn't understand why her daughter-in-law seemed so careless about her role as empress. For Sophie, that role had been sacred, one she had intentionally stepped away from for the sake of her son. But Elisabeth, on whom this role had simply fallen, didn't seem to value it the same way, and that likely drove her mother-in-law mad. Could Sisi at least find some support in her husband? Unfortunately, no. Franz was far too used to relying on his mother for everything. His approach to most decisions was basically, whatever Mama thinks is best will be best for all. When Elizabeth became pregnant with her first child, the tension between her and Sophie only deepened. Sophie, who had endured her own painful experiences with pregnancy in her youth, suddenly turned overly protective, especially when it came to Elizabeth's greatest joy, horseback riding. And okay, to be fair, maybe galloping across fields isn't the safest activity during pregnancy, but for Sisi, horses were everything. Riding was her freedom, her escape, and giving it up just to satisfy her mother-in-law's anxieties was unbearable. During this time, Elizabeth sank into a kind of quiet depression. Sophie constantly pushed her to appear in public, barely visible, to prove to the world that she was truly pregnant. It was awful. Instead, it seemed to me a blessing to be alone and able to weep. This is how she would later remember those days. The only thing that brought her any comfort during this time? Her parrots. She adored them. She would sit and watch them, take care of them. But of course, Sophie wasn't a fan. She strongly recommended that the birds be removed. Because, and I'm not making this up, she believed Elizabeth might look at them the wrong way and doom the baby to come out looking like a parrot. Honestly, that might be one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life, but either way, the parrots were soon gone. And just a few months before the baby was born, it was decided that the nursery would be placed not near Elizabeth, but right next to Sophie's apartments. Naturally, the room was decorated to the Archduchess's taste. And let's just say, Sisi had zero say in the matter. On March 5th, 1855, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl named Sophie, after her formidable mother-in-law. Naturally, the newly minted grandmother played a very active role not only during the birth itself, but also afterwards, reportedly sitting on Elizabeth's bed with the newborn in her arms. Popular portrayals often show the Archduchess as deeply disappointed that the baby wasn't a boy. But Sophie's own diaries suggest a more nuanced reality. She wrote that yes, it was a shame little Sophie wasn't a boy because she seemed so strong, but overall she was delighted and enchanted by the child. And it's worth remembering. Sophie had endured multiple miscarriages and a deeply traumatic early pregnancy herself. In letters to her own mother, she once said she didn't care whether she had a son or a daughter. So, in this particular case, perhaps she was more understanding than people give her credit for. Sophie is often accused of stealing Elizabeth's children and raising them herself, but that narrative doesn't quite hold up when you read the letters Elizabeth wrote to her, describing how little Sophie's days were going. It would be odd, after all, to be writing those kinds of updates to someone who had cut you out entirely. Before long, a second daughter was born, Gisela. This time, Sophie did not attend the birth, and slowly but surely, Elizabeth began to feel a growing sense of maternal confidence. While Sophie was away from Vienna, Elizabeth took the opportunity to have both of the children's rooms moved, farther from Sophie's apartments and closer to her own. For a while, no one told the Archduchess. But when Sophie finally found out, she was so outraged that Franz had to calm her down. She even threatened to leave the palace altogether. In 1857, the imperial couple, along with their two young daughters, set off for Hungary, a country Sisi had a deep affection for, though Archduchess Sophie openly disliked it. Sophie tried to persuade her daughter-in-law not to take such small children along, but Elizabeth insisted, and the family embarked on their royal tour. During the trip, both girls developed a fever and diarrhea. After an 11-hour struggle, the little Archduchess Sophie passed away. For Elizabeth, it was a devastating blow. Consumed by guilt, she fell into a deep depression, crying constantly, refusing food, and practically forgetting about her younger daughter Gisela. Sophie, to her credit, reacted to this tragedy with remarkable empathy. Having lost her own daughter to epilepsy at the age of 4, she understood the pain of a grieving mother, like few others could. She wrote to her son, "Sisi needs to speak of her beloved child, to surround herself with everything that reminds her of her. This way, I can bring her the consolation of God, respond to her pain, which few can understand like me." By the end of that year, Elizabeth was pregnant again, and soon the long-awaited heir to the throne, Rudolph, was born. The birth, however, was difficult, and Elizabeth recovered slowly. In various sources, I've come across claims that her mother-in-law forbade Elizabeth from breastfeeding her son, which allegedly led to problems with milk production and of persistent high fever, possibly a form of mastitis. At the same time, Sophie herself had breastfed her own sons, which makes this claim feel somewhat contradictory. In any case, weakened by childbirth and grief, Elizabeth eventually gave up the fight for control over her children. Once again, the nursery was moved back closer to Sophie's apartments. 2 years later, Sisi's health still hadn't improved. At that point, she likely experienced a serious relapse of what we would now recognise as an eating disorder. She ate very little, exhausted herself with exercise, smoked heavily, and suffered from a constant cough. Doctors recommended a change of climate, and the Empress chose Madeira. She spent almost 2 years travelling, and by the time she finally returned to court, her own children barely recognised her. Throughout this period, she did write to them regularly, signing her letters with, "Think on your mum often." But to be honest, it's hard to believe that letters could replace a mother for a 2- and 4-year-old child. Later in life, Elizabeth would blame her mother-in-law for the lack of closeness and trust in her relationship with her older children. After returning from her long travels, a more mature Elizabeth came back with renewed confidence. She finally began to assert herself as empress and speak up at court, even standing up for her son in a way she had never dared before. When Rudolph turned 6, he was separated from his sister and moved into his own household. The goal? To turn the boy into a soldier. They made him bathe in freezing cold water, stand still for hours at a time, and sometimes even left him alone in the forest to find his own way back to the palace. Let's not forget, he was only 6 years old. Understandably, this military training was pure torment for the child. He cried at night, and his health began to deteriorate. When Elizabeth learned about this, she confronted her husband and issued an ultimatum. "It's either me or Gundercourt," the name of the general responsible for Rudolph's torment. That very same day, she followed up with a written declaration. "I demand absolute authority in all matters concerning the children. Their environment, place of residence, full control over their education. In short, everything must remain exclusively under my jurisdiction until they reach adulthood. Furthermore, I demand that all decisions regarding my personal affairs, including the organisation of my household, also remain entirely my prerogative." To me, this sounds like a desperate cry from a woman who had finally reached her limit. But it worked. She won. In 1868, the couple welcomed their last child, and this time, Elizabeth travelled to Hungary to give birth. Far from the influence of the court, and she was absolutely determined. Sophie would have no say in raising this child. Elizabeth never let Marie Valerie out of her sight. She personally selected her daughter's entire household staff and put her to bed herself every night. As she told her lady-in-waiting, "Now I know what happiness a child brings, now that I have finally had the courage to love her and keep her with me." I think age played a big role in this transformation. Elizabeth was already 30, a grown woman, and this was truly conscious motherhood. But for her older children, who had been deprived of a close bond with their mother, watching this new idyllic relationship was painful. Unsurprisingly, they grew closer to their grandmother, much to Elizabeth's frustration. But you can understand them. Their mother had always been somewhere far away, rarely present in Vienna and often unreachable. They say there are 3 responses to danger: fight, freeze, or flee. As a young, inexperienced girl, Elizabeth froze. As she grew older, she started fighting back, and eventually, she simply chose to run, into endless travels across Europe. But what did her mother-in-law make of all this? By that time, Archduchess Sophie had other grief to carry. Just a year earlier, her favourite son, Maximilian, had been executed in Mexico, a devastating blow from which she never truly recovered. She also deeply worried about the growing distance between Franz and Elizabeth, but she no longer had the strength or influence to do much about it. Her power had faded, her focus shifted almost entirely to her grandchildren, the only part of the family she still felt she could protect. In the final year of Sophie's life, she and Elizabeth saw each other only once. And yet, it was Sisi who stood at her deathbed when the Archduchess passed away in 1872 at the age of 67. After her death, Elizabeth reflected, "The Archduchess surely meant so well in everything, but the paths were arduous and the manner harsh. The Emperor suffered from it as well, and she always wanted to control. From the first day, she was an obstacle to my contentment and happiness, interfering in everything and making it harder for us to simply be undisturbed together. It's clear that in Elizabeth's eyes, her mother-in-law remained the one who had destroyed her happiness." But this brings us to a very familiar question. What kind of mother-in-law did Elizabeth herself become? Did she break the cycle? Or simply repeat it, this time in Sophie's role? Her only son, Rudolf, married Belgian Princess Stephanie. And although Elizabeth gladly handed over her imperial duties, she never truly accepted her daughter-in-law. In her letters, she described Stephanie as a mighty bumpkin with long, fake tresses and cunningly watchful eyes. Stephanie, in turn, despised her mother-in-law for abandoning her imperial role and neglecting her duties. When Rudolf and Stephanie had a daughter, Elizabeth reportedly showed little interest and also even refused to acknowledge herself as a grandmother. Later, in the wake of her son's mysterious death, which may well have been a voluntary exit from life, Elizabeth once again cast blame on her daughter-in-law, writing, "If one comes to know this woman properly, one must excuse Rudolf for looking elsewhere for distraction. It is certain. Things would have been otherwise had he had a different wife, one who understood him." Quite a harsh accusation, considering that Rudolf gave Stephanie a venereal disease which left her unable to have more children. So, in the end, Elizabeth didn't manage to become a good mother-in-law herself. And history repeated itself once again. So, what do you think about the relationship between Empress Elizabeth and her mother-in-law Archduchess Sophie? Was Sophie truly a mother-in-law from hell, or just a strong-willed woman trying to protect her family? And who would you say was the tougher in-law, Sophie or Queen Victoria? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.